Just hours ago, a headline flashed across the world that made military analysts sit up straight. Iran says it launched missiles at one of the most important American military installations anywhere on Earth. Not a remote outpost, not a symbolic target, but the massive U.S. Air Base in Qatar that coordinates American air power across the entire Middle East. Now, here's the question that matters to you. Was this just another geopolitical warning shot? Or the opening move of something much bigger? Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Markets, energy prices, and global stability can shift overnight when tensions in the Gulf cross a certain line. And for investors, retirees, and anyone watching their savings, moments like these rarely stay isolated. They ripple outward through oil markets, defense spending, currency flows, and sometimes through the stock market itself. So what actually happened? Iranian officials announced that they had launched missiles toward the giant U.S. military installation known as Udeid Air Base in Qatar. If that name doesn't ring a bell, it should. This base is not just another overseas military facility, it is the central command hub for American air operations across the Middle East. Thousands of U.S. personnel operate from there. Surveillance flights, refueling missions, intelligence coordination, strike planning, all of it flows through this single strategic nerve center. Think of it as the air traffic control tower for U.S. military power in the region. Now imagine missiles heading toward it. Iranian state media quickly declared the operation a success, saying the strike demonstrated Iran's ability to hit even the most heavily defended American installations in the Gulf. According to those reports, multiple missiles were launched in what Iranian commanders described as a coordinated and calculated response to rising tensions in the region. But almost immediately, a second narrative began emerging from Washington. Officials at the Pentagon confirmed that missiles had indeed been launched toward the base, but they described a very different outcome. According to U.S. defense sources, advanced missile defense systems intercepted several incoming threats before they could reach critical infrastructure. Debris and fragments may have fallen within the perimeter of the base, but key facilities remained operational. Two narratives, two very different interpretations of the same event. And somewhere between those two versions lies the reality the world is still trying to understand. Now, before we go further, take a second to think about something most headlines aren't talking about yet. Why this base? Why now? Because the answer to that question reveals a much bigger story, one that stretches back decades and explains why the Persian Gulf has remained one of the most strategically sensitive regions on the planet. For decades, the United States has maintained a network of military bases across the Gulf. These installations serve multiple purposes. They help protect shipping lanes that carry a massive portion of the world's oil supply. They deter regional conflicts, and they allow the U.S. to respond quickly if tensions escalate anywhere from Iraq to Afghanistan to the wider Middle East. Among all those bases, Al Udeid stands out. Located southwest of Doha, the facility is enormous, long runways capable of handling the largest military aircraft, massive hangars housing fighter jets and reconnaissance planes, command centers filled with screens tracking aircraft movements across thousands of miles of airspace. This base isn't just a staging ground, it's the brain of the operation, which is exactly why it has long been viewed as a potential target in any serious confrontation involving Iran. Iran has spent years developing missile systems specifically designed to reach American bases across the Gulf region. From Tehran's perspective, these weapons serve a strategic purpose: deterrence. The idea is simple. If conflict ever escalates, Iran wants the ability to threaten the infrastructure that supports U.S. military power nearby. Missiles, unlike fighter jets, don't require control of the skies. They can be launched quickly. They travel hundreds or even thousands of miles. They are extremely difficult to intercept if fired in large numbers. Now here's where things become especially interesting. Missile warfare has quietly become one of the defining features of modern geopolitical competition. Countries like Iran have invested heavily in precision missile technology for a simple reason. It allows them to project power without building massive air forces that take decades and billions of dollars to develop. In other words, missiles level the playing field. And that reality has forced the United States to invest billions in missile defense systems designed to detect, track, and intercept incoming threats before they reach their targets. Systems like Patriot batteries, radar networks, and other defensive technologies are positioned around major installations across the Gulf. Their job is simple in theory, but incredibly complex in practice. Detect the missile, track the trajectory, launch an interceptor, destroy the threat before impact. But real-world situations are rarely that clean. And that's why military analysts around the world are paying very close attention to the events surrounding this strike. Because moments like this provide rare real-world data about how these systems perform when they are actually tested. Did the missiles get through? Were they intercepted? How many were launched? Those are the questions defense planners will be analyzing in the coming days. Now, step back for a moment and consider the broader implications. The Gulf region sits at the heart of global energy production. A significant portion of the world's oil exports pass through nearby shipping routes. When tensions rise here, energy markets notice almost immediately. Even rumors of conflict can send oil prices jumping within hours. Why? Because markets understand something very simple. Stability in this region matters enormously for the global economy. If shipping routes were ever disrupted, if infrastructure were damaged, or if major producers became involved in a widening conflict, the ripple effects would move far beyond the Middle East. Energy prices would respond first, then transportation costs, then inflation pressures across global markets. And if you're sitting in the United States watching your retirement accounts, your investments, or the broader economy, those ripple effects eventually show up in places most people don't expect. Gas prices, airline stocks, defense contractors, currency markets. Geopolitical risk tends to move quietly at first, then suddenly it becomes impossible to ignore. Now here's the twist many observers are focusing on tonight. Despite Iran's claims of a successful strike, U.S. officials insist the base remains operational. Aircraft continue to fly. Command centers remain active. The core infrastructure that supports American air operations across the region has not been significantly disrupted. If that assessment proves accurate, it suggests something important about the balance of capabilities between offensive missile systems and defensive intercept technology. But even if the physical damage was limited, the symbolic impact is undeniable. Launching missiles toward one of the largest American bases in the region crosses a psychological threshold. It signals that tensions have reached a level where direct strikes on major installations are no longer hypothetical scenarios discussed in strategy papers. They're real events happening in real time. And that raises the question nobody wants to ask out loud. What happens next? Because history shows that escalation often follows a pattern. First comes the demonstration of capability, then comes the messaging. Then comes the careful calculation of how far each side is willing to push without triggering a wider war. For now, both sides appear to be emphasizing controlled narratives. Iran highlights its ability to reach distant targets. The United States emphasizes the effectiveness of its defensive systems and the continued operation of its facilities. In other words, both sides are sending signals, not just to each other, but to allies and observers around the world. Signals of strength, signals of deterrence, signals designed to shape perception as much as reality. And that's where things become particularly important for anyone watching global markets or geopolitical stability, because perception often moves faster than facts. Investors react to headlines. Governments react to perceived threats. Markets react to uncertainty. Sometimes, the psychological impact of an event can matter just as much as the physical damage it causes. Now think about this for a moment. If a single missile strike, even one that causes limited damage, can trigger global headlines and immediate strategic analysis, imagine what would happen if incidents like this began occurring more frequently. If retaliation cycles started to accelerate, if multiple countries became involved. History offers more than a few examples of how quickly localized conflicts can expand into something much larger. And that is exactly why diplomats, military planners, and economic analysts are all watching this moment with intense focus. Because the strike on Al Udeid Air Base may turn out to be a contained episode, or it may be remembered as the moment when a simmering confrontation moved into a more dangerous phase. Now, before we continue, think about something. When you see headlines like this, missile strikes, rising tensions, military alerts, do you think global markets are underestimating the risks or overreacting to them? Because the next part of this story reveals something even more fascinating about how modern conflicts unfold and why economic consequences often appear long before the first major escalation ever occurs. To understand why this moment matters, you have to step back and look at how conflicts in the modern world actually unfold. Most people imagine wars beginning suddenly, a dramatic attack, an official declaration, a clear turning point that separates peace from conflict. But the reality is usually very different. Modern geopolitical confrontations tend to evolve gradually through signals, responses, counter-responses, and calculated moves designed to test the limits of the other side. Think of it less like flipping a switch and more like turning up a dimmer slowly. Each step increases the tension. Each move forces the other side to decide whether to escalate further or stabilize the situation. And often, both sides are trying to achieve two goals at the same time. Demonstrate strength while avoiding a full-scale war that would carry enormous costs. This is the delicate balancing act that appears to be unfolding right now. Iran's message is clear. By launching missiles toward a base as strategically important as Al Udeid, Tehran signals that it possesses the capability to reach major American installations across the Gulf region. The message is not subtle. It is meant to remind Washington and regional allies that any confrontation carries risks for everyone involved. At the same time, the United States is delivering its own message. By emphasizing that defensive systems intercepted incoming threats and that the base remains operational, American officials are reinforcing confidence in their ability to protect critical infrastructure and maintain military readiness. Both sides are speaking to multiple audiences at once: their own domestic populations, regional partners, global observers, and yes, financial markets as well. Because investors around the world are constantly trying to answer one simple question: is this the beginning of something larger? Or a contained event that will fade from the headlines within days? Now here's where history becomes an extremely useful guide. Over the past several decades, the Middle East has experienced numerous moments where tensions spiked suddenly. Missile strikes, naval confrontations, drone attacks on infrastructure. In many cases, those incidents created brief periods of market volatility before diplomatic pressure gradually stabilized the situation. But occasionally, events cross thresholds that shift the strategic landscape in ways that last for years. Consider the energy market for a moment. The Persian Gulf region remains one of the most important energy corridors on the planet. Oil produced in this area flows through shipping routes that connect global supply chains from Asia to Europe to North America. When stability in this region is questioned, even temporarily, traders respond quickly. They watch tanker movements, they monitor military alerts, they analyze every statement from government officials looking for clues about what might happen next. Even the possibility of disruption can influence pricing expectations, and that's where things become especially interesting from an economic perspective. The global economy today remains deeply connected to energy flows, and when oil prices move sharply higher, the impact rarely stays confined to the energy sector. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing becomes more expensive. Inflation pressures can reappear even after central banks spend years trying to bring them under control. For households, the effect often shows up in the most familiar place imaginable, at the gas pump. For investors, the consequences spread across entire sectors of the market: energy companies, airlines, shipping firms, defense contractors, and commodity funds. Geopolitical risk tends to move quietly through financial systems before most people notice it, which is why analysts rarely focus only on the immediate event. They watch what comes next. Will there be retaliation? Will diplomacy calm the situation? Will military forces shift positions across the region? Every new development adds another piece to a complex puzzle. Imagine being a policymaker in Washington tonight, looking at intelligence reports, satellite imagery, radar data, and communications from commanders across the region. The challenge is not just understanding what happened, but predicting how the situation might evolve in the days ahead. Escalation carries enormous risks, but doing nothing carries risks as well, because credibility and deterrence play a central role in international relations. That's why moments like this quickly become strategic calculations rather than simple reactions. At the same time, governments across the Gulf are watching closely. Many host American forces or cooperate with U.S. security operations, and they have strong incentives to prevent the region from sliding into a wider conflict that could threaten stability and economic growth. Behind the scenes, diplomacy often moves faster than the headlines reveal. Quiet conversations between governments, messages delivered through intermediaries, negotiations designed to prevent a cycle of retaliation from spiraling out of control. Yet the possibility of miscalculation always exists. History is full of moments when leaders believed they were sending limited signals only to trigger reactions far beyond their expectations. That's one reason military planners study events like the strike on Udeid Air Base so carefully. They are not only looking at the damage, but at the broader strategic data: how missile systems performed, how effective defensive interceptors were, how quickly command structures responded. Every detail becomes part of a larger assessment about preparedness, deterrence, and future security planning. For the United States, maintaining stability in the Gulf has long been a central strategic objective because the region influences energy markets, global trade routes, and the broader balance of power across continents. That reality raises a question investors and analysts often consider: how do moments like this reshape long-term economic planning? Large institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and global asset managers regularly factor geopolitical risk into their economic models. They examine how disruptions might influence commodity prices, currency movements, and international trade patterns. If tensions in the Gulf were to persist for months rather than days, energy markets could begin pricing in higher risk premiums. Shipping insurance costs might increase. Governments might accelerate efforts to diversify supply chains or invest more heavily in alternative energy infrastructure. These changes rarely happen overnight, but they often begin with events that initially appear isolated. Experienced investors therefore ask a deeper question: is this a short-term shock, or part of a longer pattern that could reshape economic expectations over time? Over the past decade, geopolitical tensions and global economic systems have become increasingly interconnected. Trade disputes, regional conflicts, technological competition, and energy security now influence financial markets in ways that were far less visible a generation ago. That means events in one region can ripple through financial systems thousands of miles away. Which brings us back to the strike that triggered today's headlines. Even if the physical damage at Al Udeid Air Base turns out to be limited, the strategic message has already been delivered. Iran has demonstrated a willingness to target a major American installation in the region, while the United States has demonstrated its ability to defend critical infrastructure and maintain operations. Now the world is watching what happens next, whether the signals lead toward stabilization or toward further escalation. That question matters not only for military planners, but for investors, policymakers, and businesses across the globe. Moments like this remind us just how interconnected the modern world has become. A missile launched thousands of miles away can trigger debates in Washington, market reactions in New York, and energy price movements across Europe and Asia within a single news cycle. Understanding the forces behind these events is therefore more important than ever, because the real story is rarely just the headline. It is the chain of decisions, responses, and consequences that follow. If you closely follow global economics, markets, and geopolitical trends, stories like this provide valuable insight into how the world actually works beneath the surface. And if you want to stay informed about the economic forces and geopolitical shifts shaping markets and long-term investment decisions, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next major story when it begins to unfold.